The men learned quickly that war did not always reward courage the way they had been taught it would. Sometimes it punished it. In the days that followed, the platoon kept moving through ground that no longer looked like a battlefield, only like a place that had been forgotten by the world. Houses without roofs. Trees snapped in half. Fences that led nowhere. Every few hundred yards, the signs of earlier fighting appeared again: a burned vehicle, discarded helmet, a medical bandage stiff with dried blood. Evidence that other men had passed through here before them, and that not all of them had passed through completely. What stayed with them most were not the bodies. It was the spaces where bodies should have been. Empty craters. Collapsed cellars. Trenches that looked as though someone had once been lying in them and then simply vanished. And every time they saw one, the same thought came back: someone might have been here, calling, waiting, believing that help would come. The army did not encourage that kind of thinking. Soldiers were trained to look forward, not sideways, and never backward. But the human mind does not follow training manuals. It wanders. It returns. It imagines. One private, barely 19, began carrying extra bandages in his pocket, even though he was not a medic. No one asked him why. Everyone already knew. At night, artillery thundered so steadily that sleep became something shallow and temporary. When it stopped, silence felt worse, because silence meant listening, and listening meant remembering. Some men talked quietly to keep their minds occupied. Others lay still and counted seconds until the guns started again. The radio operators listened constantly for traffic. Sometimes they heard voices from nearby units calling for assistance. Sometimes those calls were answered. Sometimes they were not. And sometimes they ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence, leaving only static. No one asked what happened after that. They did not want to know. The next time the order came down, it came faster and colder. A reconnaissance element had pushed too far ahead of friendly lines, chasing what they believed was a retreating German patrol. Instead, they ran into a hidden defensive position. 2 men were hit immediately. A third dragged one of them into cover. The fourth made it back and called for help. The distance was short. Less than a football field. But between the platoon and the wounded men was a strip of open ground that had already claimed 2 lives. The lieutenant called battalion. Battalion called regimental. Regimental checked artillery timetables and air coordination. And while the chain of command worked, the men on the ground waited. They could hear the wounded shouting now. Not screaming. Shouting names. The private who carried extra bandages started forward without being told. The sergeant grabbed him by the webbing and pulled him back. The lieutenant did not shout. He did not need to. Everyone could hear the order clearly enough. Hold position. Do not advance. The men lay in the dirt, gripping their rifles so tightly that knuckles turned white. Every instinct told them to move. Every lesson they had learned before the war told them that you did not leave your own behind. But this was not before the war. This was the kind of war where decisions were made far from the men who paid for them, and where timing mattered more than intention. Minutes stretched. Then came the sound that made everything worse. Not gunfire. Aircraft. American aircraft. The wounded were in the same grid square that had already been scheduled for attack. And that meant the rescue window had closed before anyone at the front even knew it had opened. When the bombs fell, no one cheered. No one spoke. Afterward, no one went to look. They already knew. Later, when replacements arrived, the veterans did not explain these things. They did not warn the new men what could happen. They did not describe the orders or the moments when rescue was denied. Not because it was secret. but because there was no way to explain it without breaking something inside the person hearing it. So they let the war teach its own lessons. And the war was very good at teaching. By the time spring came, many of the men had learned to control their faces when things went wrong. They still felt it, but they did not show it. They still wanted to help, but they learned to wait for orders, even when waiting felt like betrayal. They began to understand that survival in modern war did not belong to the bravest or the fastest, but to the ones who could endure uncertainty and still obey. This did not make them cowards. It made them soldiers in a kind of war that no longer had room for simple heroism. They fought, they advanced, they took ground, and they followed orders that no one would ever celebrate in parades. And somewhere along the way, many of them realized that the worst wounds of the war were not always the ones that bled. They were the ones that stayed silent. They were the moments when a man heard his name being called and did not answer, because answering would mean moving, and moving would mean more bodies, and more bodies would mean that the original sacrifice had changed nothing at all. That was the calculation no one talked about. But everyone learned. And that knowledge followed them long after the guns stopped, long after they went home, long after the world decided the war had been won. Because for many of them, the war never really ended at victory. It ended the first time they were ordered not to go forward. And they obeyed. By the time the men understood that rescue was no longer only about courage, but about timing, the war had already taught commanders something far colder. Every major movement on the battlefield was now connected to something larger. Artillery barrages were planned hours in advance. Airstrikes were scheduled by grid references that could not be changed once aircraft were airborne. Infantry advances were tied to those plans, not the other way around. If someone was caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, the system did not bend for them. It crushed them. Commanders were not watching individuals. They were watching maps covered in arrows and numbers. They were watching fuel supplies, ammunition counts, radio traffic, and enemy movements that shifted by the hour. When a call for rescue came in, it entered a chain of decisions that had already been set in motion long before the first bullet was fired. Sometimes the answer came back quickly. Sometimes it never came at all. At battalion headquarters, officers worked in rooms that shook when artillery fired. Telephones rang constantly. Runners moved in and out with scraps of paper soaked in rain and sweat. Every message that arrived was urgent. Every message claimed priority. And every decision meant someone would either move forward or stay where they were and face whatever came next. When a frontline officer asked for permission to retrieve wounded men, the question was never simply whether those men deserved to be saved. Everyone believed they did. The question was how many more would be lost trying to reach them, and whether the position itself would collapse if more soldiers were pulled out of line. If the enemy saw movement, they fired. If they saw stretchers, they fired more. German units had learned that wounded Americans were not just casualties, they were bait. They understood that no unit liked to leave its own behind, and they used that knowledge the same way they used machine guns and mortars. Commanders knew this too. They had seen what happened when rescue parties walked into open ground. They had seen entire squads wiped out trying to save one man. So they began issuing orders that felt impossible to accept, even when they were meant to prevent something worse. Hold position. Do not advance. Maintain the line. These were not words spoken with cruelty. They were spoken with fear, calculation, and a sense that no choice was clean anymore. Down in the mud, none of that made the order easier to obey. When the message came back denying retrieval, the men did not think about operational strategy. They thought about faces. They thought about voices they recognized. They thought about someone who had eaten beside them only hours before. And still, they stayed where they were. Not because they agreed. but because discipline had been drilled into them so deeply that it overrode instinct. In some units, officers explained the reasons. In others, they did not. Sometimes there was no time, and sometimes there was no explanation that could possibly make sense in the moment. The effect was the same. Men began to understand that survival depended not just on bravery, but on staying exactly where you were told to stay, even when every part of you wanted to move. This created a quiet, dangerous tension inside units. Soldiers trusted their leaders with their lives, but they also wondered whether their leaders would come for them if things went wrong. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. And that feeling changed how men fought. They became more cautious. They hugged cover longer. They hesitated before advancing into unknown ground. Not because they were afraid of dying, but because they were afraid of dying alone, unseen, and unrecovered. Command tried to counter this with words about duty and sacrifice, but soldiers did not need speeches to understand sacrifice. They were surrounded by it. What they needed was reassurance. And that was the one thing no one could honestly give. Even medics, protected by the Red Cross on their helmets, learned that protection was only theoretical. Enemy fire did not always stop for medical armbands. And sometimes, command refused to risk even medics if the area was too exposed. So wounded men waited. And sometimes they waited too long. The war created a strange contradiction. Soldiers were told that no one would be abandoned, that every effort would be made to recover them. And yet, everyone had seen situations where effort was deliberately withheld because the cost was considered too high. Both statements were true. And neither was comforting. Over time, officers began to carry the burden of these decisions in silence. They stopped writing about them in letters home. They stopped mentioning them in official reports. They simply recorded casualties and moved on to the next objective. But privately, many admitted that the hardest orders they ever gave were not to attack, but to stay still. To do nothing. To listen to calls they could not answer. Years later, some would say that this was when they first felt older than their age. Not because of danger, but because of responsibility. Because once you have told men not to rescue their friends, you no longer believe in simple right and wrong. You believe only in outcomes. And outcomes, in war, are counted in bodies. For the men who were left in forward positions, time stopped moving in a normal way. Minutes stretched into something shapeless. Pain became something distant and then suddenly sharp again. The noise of battle moved closer and then farther away, leaving behind long stretches of quiet that felt almost unreal. Some tried to stay awake, afraid that if they slept they would not wake again. Others slipped in and out of consciousness, dreaming of home, of voices that were no longer there, of ordinary things that now felt impossible. Those who could still move often dragged themselves into deeper cover, into shell holes, behind broken walls, under fallen trees. They learned to stay perfectly still when they heard footsteps, because they could not know whether they belonged to friend or enemy. In some cases, German soldiers passed so close that the wounded could hear them talking, laughing, lighting cigarettes. Sometimes the enemy did not notice them. Sometimes they did. When German patrols found wounded Americans, the outcome depended on the situation and the men involved. Some prisoners were taken. Some were left behind if the patrol could not safely move them. And in the worst cases, some were shot where they lay, not out of personal hatred, but because moving prisoners through active battle zones was dangerous and slowed units down. The war did not leave much room for mercy, even when individuals wanted to show it. A few wounded men survived by hiding until the lines shifted again. Days later, American units advancing through the same ground would find them alive but barely recognizable, dehydrated, infected, sometimes delirious. These survivors were treated as miracles. Stories spread through units quickly when someone was found alive after being written off as lost. But for every miracle, there were many more who were never found at all. Shelling reshaped the terrain constantly. Trenches collapsed. Craters filled with mud and debris. Bodies were buried without anyone realizing it. In some places, front lines moved back and forth so often that entire areas became mass graves without markers or records. Families back home received telegrams that said only that their sons were missing in action. That phrase covered everything from capture to death to disappearance so complete that no one could say what had happened. For those who had witnessed the moments when rescue was denied, those telegrams felt personal. They knew exactly where some of those men had last been seen. They knew they had been alive after the fighting stopped. And they knew no one had gone to them. But they also knew why. And that knowledge made it impossible to place blame on any single person. Sometimes, the final danger did not come from the enemy at all. Friendly artillery was relentless, accurate, and unforgiving. Once a barrage began, nothing in the target zone survived untouched. Wounded men who had taken cover, believing they were safe from small arms fire, were suddenly exposed to something far worse. There were cases where survivors were later found with no bullet wounds, only the evidence of blast pressure that had crushed lungs and shattered bones without leaving visible marks. And there were cases where nothing remained but fragments of equipment. The men who had been ordered not to rescue them often learned afterward that their friends had died not by enemy fire, but by shells fired from their own side. That knowledge cut even deeper. Because now it was not only that they had not helped. It was that the help they could not give had been replaced by destruction from their own army. This created a quiet, terrible paradox inside many units. Artillery saved countless lives by destroying enemy positions before infantry had to advance. It shortened battles. It broke defenses. It was one of the reasons the war was eventually won. But it also meant that anyone trapped in forward areas had almost no chance once the guns opened up. And everyone knew it. There were men who later said they prayed not for rescue, but for unconsciousness before the barrage began. Not because they had given up hope, but because they did not want to be awake when it happened. When the front moved and the area was finally secured, burial details went to work. They moved carefully, because unexploded shells were everywhere, and booby traps were sometimes left behind. They collected what they could find, recorded serial numbers when possible, and marked graves if there was time. But often, there was not. The war did not pause for recovery operations. New objectives replaced old ones. New battles erased the traces of previous ones. And gradually, even the men who had known exactly where someone fell began to lose certainty about the exact spot. Memory shifted. Landscapes changed. And the dead blended into the earth they had fought on. Among the living, something else began to change too. Men started to emotionally distance themselves from those around them. Not in cruelty, but in self-defense. They still fought for each other, still depended on one another, but they learned not to imagine the future too clearly, not to plan too far ahead, not to attach themselves too deeply to anyone whose voice might suddenly go silent. This did not make them less brave. It made them cautious with hope. And hope, once restricted, does not easily return to its original size. Even when victories came, even when enemy lines finally broke, there were no celebrations that erased the memory of those who had been left behind. Success did not bring closure. It only brought movement to the next place where the same choices would have to be made again. And they were made again. In forests, in villages, on riverbanks, in frozen fields, in ruined cities. The pattern repeated, and with each repetition it became less shocking and more accepted, which in some ways was even more disturbing. Because what horrifies at first can eventually become routine. And nothing about leaving wounded men in forward positions should ever feel routine. But war has a way of making the unacceptable feel unavoidable. By the time some units reached the later stages of the war, soldiers rarely asked whether rescue was possible. They asked only whether it was permitted. They already understood that permission meant safety for the group, and denial meant death for the individual. They did not debate it anymore. They endured it. And endurance, in the end, became the real measure of survival. When the fighting finally moved on and the ground fell quiet, the men who remained were not relieved in the way people imagine victory should feel. There was no sudden release of tension, no sense that the weight had lifted. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, as if something unfinished had been left behind and could not be retrieved. Some units were ordered to revisit areas where casualties had occurred, not to fight, but to search. What they found depended on how much time had passed and how violent the ground had become since. Sometimes they recovered bodies. Sometimes they recovered equipment and nothing else. Sometimes they found nothing at all, only places that looked as though someone had once been there. And that uncertainty followed them. Men began to replay moments in their minds, wondering whether they could have moved faster, spoken louder, argued harder. But war did not allow for appeals. Orders were given, and moments passed, and after that there was nothing left to change. What hurt most was not being overruled. It was being correct. Command had often been right about the danger. Rescue attempts would likely have failed. More men probably would have died. And yet, knowing that did not make the outcome easier to live with. It only made it harder to explain. Some soldiers became angry, not at officers, but at the entire system that had forced such choices into existence. They did not question the need to defeat the enemy. They questioned why war required them to abandon people they loved in order to do it. But those questions had no answers. Only silence. When letters came from home, they spoke of pride and prayers and belief that the boys were being looked after. The men read those lines and said nothing. There was no way to describe a battlefield where survival sometimes depended on ignoring the most human instinct of all. So they did not try. They folded the letters carefully and put them away. After the war ended, the silence continued. Parades showed smiling soldiers, clean uniforms, and flags. Families welcomed men back who had survived when so many had not. But the stories people wanted to hear were about bravery, not about restraint. About heroism, not about obedience to impossible orders. So veterans spoke of battles won, of marches, of cold nights and bad food. They did not speak of voices calling in the dark. They did not speak of standing still while someone died. Not because they were ashamed, but because they did not believe anyone who had not been there could understand. Some men carried these memories quietly and lived normal lives. Others struggled. Nightmares came. Sudden noises caused panic. And sometimes, in the middle of ordinary days, a single sound or smell could bring everything back as if it were happening again. Psychologists would later give names to these reactions. The soldiers did not. They simply called it the war. Among officers, the burden was different but just as heavy. Many had followed doctrine perfectly and lost men anyway. They had made correct tactical decisions and still felt morally wrong. They had preserved their units and destroyed their peace of mind. Some tried to justify what they had done by reminding themselves of the larger picture of campaigns won and lives saved by holding positions and maintaining schedules. Others stopped trying to justify it at all. They accepted that war had demanded something from them that no civilian life would ever fully understand. Years later, when historians began studying battlefield psychology more closely, they found that moments of denied rescue were often remembered more vividly than moments of direct combat. Because combat was chaos. But restraint was conscious. It was chosen. And choice is harder to forget than fear. In interviews, veterans rarely spoke in dramatic language. They did not say they were haunted. They said they still thought about it sometimes. They said they wondered what became of certain men. They said they hoped someone else had found them. They did not blame anyone. But they never truly forgave the situation either. What remains hardest to accept is that these decisions were not rare exceptions. They were part of how industrial war functioned. When millions of men fought across entire continents, individual lives were constantly weighed against operational necessity. Not by cruel people. By practical ones. And practicality, in war, often looks like indifference from the outside. But inside the units, among the men who had to live with those orders, it never felt indifferent. It felt like carrying something that could not be put down. And many of them carried it for the rest of their lives. As the war drew closer to its end, the battles did not become easier, only shorter. Men were still being lost, still being left in places that could not be safely reached, still becoming numbers in reports instead of bodies that could be carried back. What changed was not the reality of the decisions, but the way soldiers understood them. By now, most no longer expected that every wounded man could be saved. They had seen too much to believe in that kind of certainty. What they did expect was that the war would someday stop asking for these choices. And when it finally did, when orders came that no longer involved advancing under fire, many soldiers found that the silence was harder to adjust to than the noise had been. At home, people spoke of victory and sacrifice and courage. They wanted stories that fit into neat shapes, stories with heroes and endings that made sense. But the memories that followed many veterans into civilian life did not fit into those shapes at all. They were unfinished moments. Unanswered calls. Decisions that could never be revisited. Some men tried to explain this to their families. Most did not. They did not want to be asked why they had not done more, or why they had followed orders that seemed impossible to accept. And they did not want to explain a truth that had no clean explanation. That sometimes, in order for many to live, few had to be abandoned. It was not a rule anyone liked. It was not a rule anyone felt proud of. But it was a rule that modern war enforced again and again, whether soldiers believed in it or not. Military doctrine would later describe these moments with technical language. Risk management. Force preservation. Operational necessity. But none of those phrases captured what it felt like to lie in the dirt and stay still while someone you knew was dying ahead of you. Doctrine explained the reason. It did not remove the memory. Historians studying battlefield psychology eventually came to understand that these moments caused a different kind of trauma than direct combat. Fear could fade. Adrenaline could pass. But responsibility lingered. The sense that a choice had been made, even if it had not truly been free. Many veterans said that what troubled them most was not what they had done, but what they had been unable to do. They had wanted to help. They had believed in helping. And they had learned that wanting was not enough. In later years, when asked about courage, some veterans said that courage was not always about moving forward under fire. Sometimes it was about staying where you were told to stay, even when everything inside you was screaming to move. That kind of courage did not look heroic. It looked like obedience. It looked like restraint. And it left no medals behind. Only memories. Today, these stories are rarely told because they do not fit the image of war that people prefer to remember. They do not celebrate triumph or sacrifice in a way that feels noble. They reveal the cost of decisions that saved many lives by sacrificing the chance to save a few. But they are part of the truth of how World War II was fought. Not only with bravery, but with terrible discipline. not only with heroism, but with acceptance of loss that could not be prevented without making the loss even greater. The men who were ordered not to rescue their own did not forget those moments. They carried them quietly. And in that silence, they carried the weight of a war that demanded not just courage, but obedience to choices no human being should ever have to make.